You won't believe what happened when Barron Trump walked into a local coffee shop one morning. What started as a simple visit for a cup of coffee quickly turned into a moment that left everyone in the shop stunned. Trump says he won't define all people for anything because we represent so much. I mean, it was just an ordinary day, or so it seemed. Barron Trump, looking like any other young man, stepped up to the counter, expecting nothing more than a regular interaction with the barista. But what happened next was far from ordinary. The barista, not recognizing Barron, made a huge mistake. She mistook him for someone else. But the way Barron handled the entire situation, it will leave you speechless. Instead of reacting with frustration or annoyance, Barron's calm and graceful response took everyone by surprise. His reaction was so unexpected, it quickly became the talk of the town. Like George and Monster had gooey, but he was so cool at stuff, and this person, covery. In just a few moments, Barron Trump showed the world how to turn an awkward moment into a powerful lesson in kindness and humility. Stick around, because what he did next will absolutely shock you. That was Jason Charnes, The Story of Band Practice, from TV show popularized by Game Show. It was a cool, breezy morning in a quiet part of the city, the kind of day that made you want to take your time and savor every sip of your favorite drink. Barron Trump, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, stepped into the local coffee shop, a cozy spot known for its warm ambiance and the friendly faces of regular customers. As he walked in, the sound of the door's soft chime echoed through the air, blending with the low hum of casual conversation and the whir of the espresso machine. The barista, a young woman in her 20s, was busy behind the counter preparing drinks. She didn't immediately notice Barron's entrance. She was focused on her work, frothing milk and pulling shots of espresso. Barron approached the counter, his hands in his pockets, waiting patiently for his turn. He wasn't looking for attention. He simply wanted a peaceful moment with a cup of coffee, like so many others who walked in every day. As Barron stepped up to the counter, the barista finally looked up. She blinked for a moment, then gave him a friendly smile. "Hi there! What can I get for you today?" "Just a regular latte, please," Barron replied with a calm voice, giving the barista a warm but quiet smile in return. The barista, still focused on her task, glanced at him and then looked at the name on the order screen. She paused, a slight frown crossing her face. "That'll be $5.50, she said, not fully registering who he was. Barron handed over the money, and it was in that moment the confusion began. "Thanks, enjoy your drink," the barista said as she turned to make the latte. But there was a slight hesitation in her actions, a moment of uncertainty, like she had made up her mind but realized it was better not to delay. "Actually, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think you might be mistaken," Barron said, catching her attention before she could walk away. The barista turned back slightly puzzled. "Mistaken? Oh, did I get your order wrong?" Barron shook his head lightly, giving her a reassuring look. "No, I think you mistook me for someone else. You see, I'm Barron Trump." There was a beat of silence. The barista's eyes widened in shock, and her face turned slightly pale. She had not realized that the young man standing in front of her was, in fact, the son of former President Donald Trump. "Oh," she stammered, clearly embarrassed. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." She began to quickly grab the latte from the counter, her face flushed with the realization of her mistake. "I didn't recognize you." Barron, however, remained calm. His expression didn't change. He wasn't angry or irritated. Instead, he gave her a gentle smile. "It's okay. Really, no need to apologize," he said with the same poise he always carried. "It's just a coffee, no big deal." The barista, still feeling flustered, could hardly believe her eyes. She glanced at the rest of the coffee shop where a few regulars had begun to notice the exchange. It was clear that Barron had already made an impression, but it was his reaction that left the barista and everyone else in the room speechless. Where most people might have reacted with impatience or frustration, Barron's composure and humility were remarkable. He didn't raise his voice or draw attention to himself. He simply accepted the situation with grace, understanding that mistakes happen. The calmness in his demeanor was both disarming and refreshing, and it created a sudden shift in the mood of the entire coffee shop. As the barista handed over the latte, she couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the young man standing before her. And as Barron took his drink and moved to a quiet corner of the shop, the room seemed to settle into a peaceful hush. There was no drama, no spectacle, just a simple moment of kindness and understanding. Little did they know this was only the beginning of a story that would soon captivate the entire city. As Barron took his latte and found a small table by the window, the coffee shop seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The gentle hum of the espresso machine filled the air, and the soft murmur of conversations resumed. But something had changed in the atmosphere. The barista, though back to making drinks, couldn't shake the moment that had just unfolded. Her thoughts raced, and she kept glancing over at Barron, who sat calmly with his drink, seemingly lost in his own world. Along came Baron Varys Morales. It wasn't until a few minutes later that her mind fully processed the situation. The realization began to settle in like a slow drip of cold water. She hadn't just made a mistake by not recognizing who Barron was. There was something much deeper at play. She had assumed, just like so many others, that because of his family name, Barron Trump must be someone she should be wary of, someone to be cautious around. It was a preconceived notion that had been instilled in her without her even realizing it. She had expected him to act in a certain way, perhaps entitled, perhaps difficult, maybe even arrogant. After all, that was the narrative that so often followed people in positions of power. But instead, what she had witnessed was the complete opposite. Barron had been kind, composed, and understanding, without a hint of superiority or entitlement. His response to her mistake wasn't filled with scorn or sarcasm. It was simply kind. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how quickly she had judged him. She had seen the name Trump and, without consciously thinking about it, expected the worst. It was a moment of deep self-reflection. She wondered how many times in her life she had made assumptions about people based on who they were, where they came from, or what they represented. She thought back to the way he had responded, calmly, with no sense of ego or frustration. He hadn't demanded an apology. He hadn't made her feel bad for her mistake. Instead, he had quietly corrected her, as if to say, "It's okay. We all make mistakes." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bell above the door ringing again as a new customer walked in, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been so wrapped up in her assumptions about who Barron was, based on his last name, that she hadn't taken the time to see him for who he truly was, a young man just trying to go about his day like anyone else. Her eyes drifted to Barron again, watching as he quietly sipped his drink, lost in his thoughts. He wasn't the arrogant figure she had imagined. He wasn't trying to stand out or create a scene. He was just there. And in that quiet moment, she realized something important. It wasn't Barron Trump who had been the problem. It was her own assumptions about him. She had let the labels cloud her perception, and in doing so, she had almost missed the chance to experience the humanity of the person sitting right in front of her. As the realization washed over her, the barista's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and humility. She couldn't believe how easily she had fallen into the trap of judgment, but it was a moment of growth. She wasn't sure if Barron had noticed the effect his reaction had on her, but it had left a lasting impression. For the first time in a long while, she felt a tug of guilt, not for her mistake in not recognizing him, but for her preconceived notions about who he was. She thought about how many other people, including herself, had been too quick to judge others based on where they came from or what they represented. The weight of her realization made her pause. Barron Trump had taught her something invaluable in that brief, quiet interaction. Kindness, understanding, and patience were far more important than titles or family names. It didn't matter who he was, who his father was, or what others thought of him. What mattered was how he treated people in moments of imperfection. And that, she realized, was a far more powerful lesson than any headline could ever offer. And just as Barron had handled the situation with grace, the barista decided she would do the same. She would approach her work and her interactions with others with more care and understanding. Because in the end, people were far more than the labels they wore or the assumptions others made about them. And sometimes it just took a moment of realization to break free from the judgments that limited her understanding of the world. As she turned back to her work, the buzz of the coffee shop seemed less significant now. She felt a sense of calm, a quiet understanding that perhaps, after all, it wasn't the world that needed to change. It was the way people viewed one another that could truly make the difference. And she, like Barron, would choose to look at people not through the lens of assumptions, but through the eyes of empathy. The hum of the coffee shop, once soothing, now felt distant to the barista as she continued to replay the conversation in her mind. Barron Trump, of all people, had quietly but firmly corrected her mistake, not with anger or impatience, but with grace. And in that moment, the world seemed to slow down. Her hands shook slightly as she wiped down the counter, the weight of her earlier judgment still pressing on her chest. Except the person she had been sworn to watch over had already fleshed her, as distant as the night. She dared not turn around, hesitant, the way a line of errands still pending at the counter, the way to close as the day dawned, softened by the memory, transformed by the pain, the lost time putting her life at risk. Water congealer. The winter gross softened unresponsive its own way to slip away. Hadn't her mother? Iron knit, burnt Goldstein's book? Yes. What had just happened felt more profound than a simple case of mistaken identity. It was a moment that she wouldn't soon forget, one that would change her perspective forever. She glanced over at Barron again, who was still sitting at his table by the window. He hadn't noticed her staring, too engrossed in whatever was on his phone. It was a strange sense of quiet resolve that seemed to radiate from him, and the barista couldn't help but marvel at how he carried himself. He wasn't some larger-than-life figure you might expect him to be based on public perception. He wasn't demanding attention or making an effort to prove who he was. He was simply there, existing in the space around him like everyone else. But the weight of the realization hadn't quite left her. She had been so quick to judge him because of his last name. For a split second, the name Trump had brought with it assumptions, negative ones she hadn't even fully acknowledged until now. It was as if she had placed him in a box that was carefully constructed by the opinions and stories surrounding his family. And when she had made the mistake of not recognizing him, her first thought wasn't one of humility, and no, it was judgment. She had imagined he might react with disdain or entitlement, but Barron had done none of those things. He had simply corrected her with a calmness that startled her. And then she did okay, after all. Her mind circled back to the way he'd handled everything. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made her feel bad. Instead, he'd chosen to treat the situation like a simple misunderstanding. And that choice to stay composed, to not react with defensiveness, was a form of strength that the barista hadn't been prepared for. It was a response that challenged everything she thought she knew about power and privilege. Then he passed her the barista something to drink, and they poured over everything else. Her mind circled back to the way he'd handled everything so that she forgot. He hadn't. A few minutes passed before she felt the urge to approach him. She wasn't sure what compelled her to do so, whether it was the desire to apologize or simply to understand more about the person sitting across the room, but she found herself walking toward his table. The closer she got, the more her nerves grew. She had already made a mistake, and she didn't want to make another. What if she came off as insincere? A ton. I'll find a trail. He said, what if he didn't want to talk? Still, she pressed forward, driven by a feeling that something important had been left unsaid. In the silence on the bus ride, she wondered, willing her eyes to move. At times, she dangled back to it, searching her memory for something she would be prepared to say. What really had she to say? Hadn't she lost the will to live? When she finally reached his table, Barron glanced up from his phone. His eyes locked onto hers for a brief moment, and she felt a flicker of uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words were slow to come. She wanted to say something about the mistake, about how she had assumed things based on the stories she'd heard, but the weight of it felt too much to explain in just a few sentences. Can I ask you a question? He wondered. What's going on at home for you? Hi, she began, her voice a little shakier than she'd intended. I just wanted to apologize for the mix-up earlier. Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set down his phone and looked at her thoughtfully. There was no irritation on his face, no sense of superiority, just quiet attentiveness. He nodded once, and his voice was calm as he spoke. It's okay, he said simply. You didn't know who I was. She nodded, but the words didn't seem to be enough. The apology felt hollow when compared to the realization that it hit her like a wave. She wanted to say more, to admit how wrong she had been to judge him, how she had let a name cloud her perception, but the words weren't coming, not in the way she needed them to. Look, I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable earlier, she continued. I guess I assumed things based on a name, and that's not right. Barron didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he gave her a small smile, a gesture that held no trace of condescension, only understanding. Everyone does that sometimes, he said, his voice steady and kind. We all make assumptions based on what we think we know, but the important part is being open to seeing people for who they really are. The barista felt a warmth spread through her chest as Barron's words sank in. It was as if he had taken her mistake and turned it into a lesson that transcended the immediate moment and spoke to something much bigger. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset. He had taken her mistake in stride, showing her the grace that she hadn't known she needed, not just in the way she interacted with him, but in the way she viewed the world around her. Listen, I definitely have an accomplished early birthday, along with the dates. I didn't expect you to respond like that, she admitted, feeling the truth of the moment weigh heavily on her tongue. I thought maybe you'd be upset or angry, but you weren't. You just handled it so calmly. Barron shrugged lightly as if it was nothing extraordinary. It's not a big deal. People make mistakes. It's how we handle them that matters. She was struck by his ability to speak so plainly about something so profound. She had expected him to be resentful, to act out of a sense of entitlement, as so many people would have in his position. But Barron Trump was nothing like the caricature she had been taught to expect. He was, in fact, more like the kind of person she aspired to be, thoughtful, patient, and full of humility. The barista stood there, momentarily speechless. She felt like she had been given a glimpse into a side of Barron that the world often overlooked, a side that wasn't defined by his family name or the headlines. It was clear now that his family background didn't dictate who he was or how he treated others. It was the way he chose to treat people in small, quiet moments, like this one, that truly defined him. Thank you, she finally said, her voice softer now, filled with genuine appreciation. For showing me that. Barron gave a small nod and smiled, but he didn't linger on it. Instead, he picked up his drink, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to have this conversation, to offer this kind of understanding. Um, Take care, he said, his words simple but sincere. She nodded, feeling a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. As she turned to walk away, she knew that the encounter would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just the lesson he had taught her in that moment, but the way he had treated her with dignity and respect, despite everything that could have gone differently. These words, the moment of truth, the moment when the barista had the chance to see beyond her assumptions, to recognize that every person has a story and that no one should be judged by the surface level. Barron Trump had unwittingly reminded her of the power of kindness and humility, and she couldn't help but feel deeply grateful for the unexpected lesson she had learned.